I know you're excited to meet Gloria Steinem, so here we go. Gloria Steinem is a writer, lecturer, editor, and feminist activist. After graduating Phi Beta Kappa from Smith College, she became the face of the women's rights movement in the 1960s and founded Ms. Magazine in 1972, which covers and continues to cover online topics like women's rights, domestic violence, reproductive rights, and freedom and equality for all. In addition to her many national awards in journalism, she received the first Doctorate of Human Justice awarded by Simmons College, the Bill of Rights Award from the American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California, the National Gay Rights Advocates Award, the Liberty Award of the Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Ceres Medal from the United Nations, and a number of honorary degrees. Parenting Magazine selected her for its Lifetime Achievement Award in 1995 for her work in promoting girls' self-esteem. And Biography Magazine listed her as one of the 25 most influential women in America. In 1993, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, New York. She travels in this and other countries as an organizer and lecturer, and is a frequent media spokeswoman on issues of equality. We are absolutely honored to have her here with us this evening. I've been fortunate to spend the afternoon with her, and I've been inspired, and I hope you will be too. Please welcome Gloria Steinem.
Well, are we going to have a good time tonight, or what? Thanks to all the planning and work that has gone into this evening, and thanks to Women's History Month, which soon, one day, like women's studies, like Black studies, gay and lesbian studies, Native American studies, we one day will be studying human history, we hope, so we won't need a month, right? And thanks most of all to each one of you who have been generous enough to take time out of your busy lives and come here tonight and take a chance on a stranger, you know? It walks, it talks, it's a feminist, right? Because of all these things, we have something very precious here tonight, which is about an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and a half in this room together. And a combination of people that has never happened before in exactly the same way, will never happen again in exactly the same way. And each of us we ourselves are combinations of millennia upon millennia of environment and heredity combined in a way that could never have happened before and could never happen again. I never understood the nature versus nurture argument, did you? Because obviously it's both. But because we are here in this unique situation, here's my plan. If all goes well, each of us, me included, will leave here with some new fact, some new outrageous organizing tactic, some feeling of support, some aha, some new action. And that means that because we have met here together, the next day and the next, I hope, will be better than they otherwise would have been. So in order to make that happen, I need your help, especially during what's usually called the question and answer period, because I want to learn from you. Unless things are equal, they don't work, right? And also, we need to overcome this old-fashioned structure we have here of necessity because of our numbers. You're looking at each other's backs, I'm looking at you. This is a hierarchy. Hierarchy is based on patriarchy. Patriarchy doesn't work anywhere anymore, including in this room. So I'm hoping that during the question and answer period, we can become a circle and really look at each other's faces and learn from each other. And that means you get to talk about anything. Okay, this is permission. You get to talk about anything. And I want to tell you that audiences do talk about anything. Maybe I should tell you a few things that audiences say, just so you'll feel okay about talking about. I've always wanted to do a whole book of what people, it makes a force field here. People will get up and say things that they wouldn't say to their best friend. But because there's this kind of energy in this room, people will say extraordinary things. I remember talking about dividing, we were in the midst of a discussion of dividing housework, and women were talking about how they kind of felt guilty about dividing house, even though they knew, that it should be equal. And there was a woman, an older woman sitting in front. I was afraid we were offending her. And she got up and she turned to the audience and because who had been talking about, my husband doesn't even pick up his underwear. And she said, when my husband leaves his underwear on the floor, I find it quite helpful to nail it to the floor. Is that not great? And there was some other discussion, I remember, which we got quite bawdy, actually, about younger men. And, did it make sense to have affairs with younger men since they were more likely to support women's equality? And some woman was getting up and saying, well, of course, they're, more enlightened. We raised them. And again, there was some woman who was was not saying a word. I thought, oh God, we're really offending her. And she was older, that means as old as me. And she got up and turned to the audience and she said, well, my dears, when you are having an affair with a younger man, not if, when, right? Try never to get on top, you look like a bulldog. Okay, I just want to loosen up the group. Sorry. You can say whatever. We can talk about our favorite examples of women's history that are relatively unknown. I mean, some of them maybe you know by now, like, did you know that Mozart had a sister, an older sister, who he said was the talented one? But she was sent home to get married, and we only know about her because of the correspondence between the two of them. My favorite one, actually, because I lived in India for a couple of years, has to do with Gandhi, an Indian friend of mine, and we were both feeling that Gandhian methods of nonviolence were well suited to women's movements around the world, so we were trying to gather his letters into a book to distribute to women's movements. And we finally came to a wonderful woman named Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who had worked with Gandhi, extraordinary woman, and she listened to us very patiently, and when we were finished, she said, well, of course, my dears, we taught him everything he knew. It turned out that the nonviolent methods had come from the women's movement that was, of course, huge in the 1800s and 1900s as well, and was working against child marriage and many ills for women. And it is true that we are made to feel grateful for things that we ourselves invented, if you know what I mean. So I hope that during this time, just tell us the part of women's history that means some aha, that means the most to you, that will help us as well. I have a button at home that says, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And that is true of the history of women of all races. It's true of African American history. It's certainly true of Native American history. On this ground where we now are, one of the Iroquois Confederacy nations was, right? And equality then existed between women and men. Women controlled their own fertility. Did we learn this? No, I certainly. Did we learn that the suffrage movement was inspired by the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy and the equality that they presented to women who had come here from Europe at a very unequal time? No, at least I did not learn this. So please share, whatever, celebrate women's history by giving us a piece of it. And I hope that we also look at the larger ways we are now realizing that we have all, women and men, been punished by gender. I mean, gender doesn't exist. Race doesn't exist. We all came from southern or eastern Africa with minor adjustments that happened because of climate. Gender is made up. And we are all punished by this kind of division of human qualities into masculine and feminine, instead of understanding that they are all human and that we all possess all of them. We are punished in some very big ways, actually, because it has taken us all this time to figure out that the model of violence, the normalization of violence in the rest of society happens in the home. You can exactly predict the degree of violence in the street or in foreign policy by the degree to which violence is normalized in child rearing and in the home. But because the family and child rearing are feminine, and public life, foreign policy are masculine, we don't learn that this causes that. It's so exact that, interestingly, the states in which punishing the corporal punishment of children is still legal are all red states. And the states in which it is illegal are all blue states. Isn't that interesting? Now, the cause and effect can go either way, but I'm just saying that we will never uproot the cause of violence, the normalization of violence, until we take seriously family forms and child rearing forms, and until we look at democracy as rooted in a democratic family. So, I say this really just to open up whatever you would like to share with us so that we can turn this room into a circle. However, it is true that all of us, however different we may be, wherever we came from this evening, we are all meeting at a particular time in history right now. We are about halfway through what is, from a historical point of view, the second wave of feminism in this country. The first wave, the suffragist and abolitionist wave, lasted about 100 years, and it gained for women of all races and men of color a legal identity as human beings. Everyone, in varying degrees of cruelty, had been chattel before. Everyone, women of all races and men of color, had been owned. And indeed, the legal status of wives was the basis for the legal status of slaves. So, these two things had always gone together. So the suffragist and the abolitionist era was a huge victory to gain definitions of all of more than half of this country as human beings and citizens. I mean, this is huge. Having got a legal identity, we're now in a century of striving for legal equality, legal and social equality. That probably will take 100 years too. We're only halfway through it. Don't know how to break this to you, but we have at least 50 years to go in this. And probably there will be other waves in the future until finally no one's humanity or destiny is influenced by the single element of race or class or sex or sexuality, or, because there are a billion things that go into making up the uniqueness that is each of us. And here we are meeting at this time in history. Now, it's especially important to realize that because the current way of dealing with, of opposing, or one of the current ways of opposing the women's movement is to say it's over. It used to be, when I started, people would say, it's crazy, my wife is not interested, it's against nature, it's against Freud, it's against God. We would say, yes, it's against all those things. But that was the first wave of resistance. It's impossible. It's unnatural. Forget it. It's not necessary at all, right? Now the current wave of resistance is, well, it used to be necessary, but it's not anymore. It's over. Young women are not interested in feminism. Actually, young women are very interested in feminism, whether they call it womanism or mujerista or women's liberation or girls with lots of R's. In fact, young women and women in general are more likely to self-identify as feminists than as Republicans. They don't tell you that part, right? Or as Democrats, because most people are now, independents in any case. I mean, the word feminist has been demonized, and we are told that it is unpopular, but actually it's one of the most popular words in the country. And all the other words that mean that. So, we really, we have a need to look at where we are in history and look at each other instead of the images that are brought to us through the media, and instead of the generalities that come to us in large part by an effort to stop social change, to demonize words like liberal and feminist. The Rush Limbaughs of the world, to whom I am a feminazi, which is especially ahistorical since it happens that Hitler was anti-feminist. And the first thing he did when he came to power was to close the family planning clinics and declare abortion a crime against the state. Excuse me, you can put National Socialist statements on a piece of paper and current ultra right-wing statements. You can't tell, which is which. So, it's very important that we understand that we are in a particular time in history, that we take a long view, that we don't fall for the idea that it's over and therefore become inactive, that we really look at each other and what we are really doing, as opposed to what the image of the movement or of change is that's put before us. We find ourselves working on themes that are familiar, but in new ways. For instance, reproductive freedom as a fundamental human right, I would say, is number one, only because, or deeply because, women are in this jam in the first place because our bodies are the means of reproduction. And there's an effort in various ways, religious, economic, all kinds of ways, by different kinds of patriarchies to control reproduction, to decide the number of workers and the race and so on, as we know. So at least in this way, we have enunciated reproductive freedom as a fundamental human right, like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It is a fundamental human right. And there is massive agreement around the world on the importance of reproductive freedom. And in this country, there is a huge majority of Americans who believe that it is up to an individual woman to decide when and whether to have children. It's not something that the government decides. So, to have enunciated that as a new freedom, which was not fully enunciated in the last wave, is an enormous victory. And much has changed. You know, for instance, let's see, when I first arrived in this movement, women could not get a tubal ligation, a sterilization, without their husband's written permission and without having already had 2 to 4 children, depending on the physician. What's another example? Fannie Lou Hamer, the great civil rights leader, whom I knew and is my contemporary. She's no longer with us, I'm sorry to say. She told me that her grandmother had 23 children, 20 of whom were by rape. Okay. She was supposed to produce cheap labor for the fields. By the time Fannie Lou came along, cheap labor was not as important. The fields were more mechanized, right? And she was sterilized without her knowledge, without her permission, in a Mississippi hospital. I mean, that's, you know, the degree to which the control of women's reproductive lives has gone on. Now, we have continued, we have the principle of reproductive freedom, which means the freedom to have children as well as not to have children. We agree on it, but we see constant backlash. Certainly the defunding or the attempts to defund Planned Parenthood, which we have all read about, are a very current example. The notion that abortion is somehow a crime against the Catholic Church, which actually used to approve of abortion and regulate it and well into the 1800s. Did you know that? There's an interesting thing about history. We can talk about that later. But the idea that, I mean, it has always been, it is natural for women to control what happens in their own bodies. And the Native women who once were on this ground did. They did control their own fertility. I was thinking about this lately because Sarah Palin, who of course is a great opponent of abortion and reproductive rights and so on, makes much of Mama Grizzlies. Have you noticed that? So I, who defend Sarah Palin's right to be wrong, but have a deep feeling for Mama Grizzlies, a much deeper feeling for Mama Grizzlies. I thought, wait a minute, I bet she's wrong about Mama Grizzlies. So I researched Mama Grizzlies, and it turns out that they are what you might call feminist. I mean, even compared to other animals. They mate later. They have 2 cubs instead of 3 or 4. And even compared to brown bears, say, you know, they're much more, right, seemingly independent. I don't know how they would phrase it. And if they are pregnant and the food supply is poor, their health is poor, the winter is hard, they reabsorb the fetus into their own bodies. I mean, you know, it's natural. It's part of nature. That, of course, this process that goes on in women's bodies is controlled by women's bodies in the animal world and in the human world. But we see where we are, even though reproductive freedom has been the theme for 40 years now, we see where we are and we see the opposition to it. And we understand, I hope now we understand why. There is another big theme that has been the same for 40 years, but in different ways, of work. We all started out with equal pay, known as the part I agree with, you know, equal pay for equal work. Everybody agreed with that. We don't have it yet, though. And I noticed that you all on this campus are selling lollipops for $1 to men and to 77 cents for women. There's a little point there, right? Thank you for that. So, you know, we're still working towards equal pay. But what we have not yet done is not only pay for equal work, but redefine work. From the beginning, we've been saying homemakers should never be called women who don't work. Homemakers actually work longer and harder than any class of worker in the United States, with more incidents of violence, with more drug addiction, more alcoholism, more, all kinds of job risks. It is a huge, huge job. And every once in a while, the Department of Labor gives figures on what it would cost to replace the average homemaker. And it's huge. I think it's over $20,000 now, isn't it? I mean, it's huge. It started out at $9,000 and it's been going. So I think we understand that. But now we have begun to see how it is we can value that work. Really, literally value it. It is at least a third of the productive work in this country. It's more than half of the productive work in agricultural countries, the work that women do in the home and around the home, because in agricultural countries they're often also growing food for their families, and they are responsible for that food growth. So we can, actually, it's not impossible, it's quite easy, and we have the legislation, to attribute a value to the work, the productive work of raising and socializing humans, of human maintenance in the home, to give a attributed economic value to that, and make that amount of money tax deductible if we pay taxes, and if we're too poor to pay taxes, tax refundable, which would then substitute for the disaster of welfare reform. I mean, these are, it's a distance from revaluing work to redefining work, and that is the future. We have redefined family in many, many ways. We now absolutely understand that family is about commitment and nurturing. It's not about whether the two parents are the same gender or different genders, or whether people have children or don't have children. It's about function. It's not about possession. It's not about property. It's about nurturing, and it's about function. We have understood that women can do what men can do. This is good in the job area. But we have not understood yet that men can do what women can do. And so most women have two jobs, one outside the home and one inside the home. And most children are suffering from not seeing loving and nurturing men in their lives, whether related or unrelated. So they know that men can be as loving and nurturing as women. It's a libel on men to say that men cannot be as patient and as empathetic and all the qualities that are wrongly called feminine, but they're just the qualities necessary to raise children. We have begun to redefine family according to function and according to content, not just form. That is a huge, huge, huge difference, and we are just beginning to see what its larger impact is politically and in the world. And of course, there's the whole area that I don't know what to call, I guess culture. I guess you would call it culture, except in a way, culture is what happens to women. Politics is what happens to men. Do you know what I mean? But it's all the same thing. Calling it culture is just a way to say you can't change it. And to appeal to cultural relativism and so on. But actually, the enunciation of human rights makes it clear that there are human rights that pervade and must pervade every culture. I think the events in Egypt and throughout the Middle East, and I understand currently even in Saudi Arabia, have, I hope, caused us to understand that the people in the Arab world are not different from us. You know, they want dignity and self-determination and democracy. I fear that we, after 9/11, let a very small, extremely small number of people color our ideas of who lived in the Arab world and who, of what the Islamic culture was. And I hope that these last few weeks of television have changed us. You know, I mean, look at what we have seen in the streets, and the incredible peaceful restraint of the average people who were out there seeking self-determination and democracy. So, you know, it's a symbol to me of how important it is to look at our shared humanity, cherish the differences that are not contrary to human rights. I would think chief among them is food, all kinds of different food. Would you not be bored by having just one kind of cooking? Think about all the great language, poetry, music, you know, infinite dance, infinite variation among our cultures that we cherish, and at the same time shared basic communal human rights. But all of these efforts, whether in their different stages, whether it's reproductive freedom as a basic human right, or revaluing and redefining work, or diversifying families so that they truly are about function, not about form, not about ownership, but about nurturing, and looking at the politics of culture, which I have to say, for me, includes the politics of monotheism. You know, have you ever noticed that when God looks like the ruling class, you're really in deep shit, you know? So, now, I have great respect for everybody inside all the great religions who are trying to bring spirituality, universal spirituality back, you know? So we all do this in different ways. But as long as we think that God resides in one race more than others, in one sex more than others, in humans more than in nature, which is part of the problem, it makes it okay to conquer nature. Once, perhaps some of you here too have taken the trip down the Nile or up the Nile from the Nubian part of the closest to Africa to Cairo, and because it's such an old center of civilization, you can see it happening in the structures and in the carvings along the way, that in the oldest part of the Nile, God is present in everything, in birds and butterflies and papyrus and men and women, and you know. So then you go a little further, it's 1,000 years later, suddenly there's not so much nature, and the goddess only has a son, no daughter. And then you go a little further, it's a few millennia onward, and the sun has gotten very big and become a consort. And nature is beginning to disappear. And finally, you know, this keeps going until you get to close to Cairo, where there are mosques in which no representation of women or nature is allowed. So, you know, there's an Egyptologist I recommend to you named Henry Breasted, and he wrote in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he says, monotheism is but imperialism in religion. I thought, God, that sort of clears your sinuses, right? You know, so, right. I mean, yes, you know. So, in our various ways, I think many of us are striving to bring the sacred back to everyone, to all human beings, to all races, to all nature, because the same force that withdrew God from women in order to make it okay to conquer women, withdrew God from nature in order to make it okay and even necessary to conquer nature. And together we are trying to say, wait a minute, all living things are sacred. All living things are sacred in whatever way we are able to do that. Now, having presented to you a situation in which we're just sort of, what are we trying? I guess we're saying that the last, depends where we are in the world, 500 or 600 years here, since Europeans became the pioneers of patriarchy here, 3,000 to 5,000 years in the Middle East and other parts of the world, depends. But basically, we're kind of saying it's an experiment that failed, so we're going to see that if what once existed could exist again in a different way, thanks to much better communications and all that we are capable of now. I mean, it's, just a little thing like overthrowing patriarchy, monotheism, nationalism, racism. It's sort of daunting, right? I just wanted to, I was trying to figure out how to leave you with an understanding that the art of, which I truly believe, the art of behaving ethically and effectively is behaving as if everything we do matters. We have no idea which thing we do matters. So if we just behave as if everything we do matters, the way we treat each other, the kind of language we use, the vision of us as a circle instead of a hierarchy, well, you know best what you can do in your lives. But I looking at Congress and looking at the difference between the what's going on in Congress now and what our public opinion polls tell us the majority of Americans want, it's hugely, hugely different. Part of the problem, of course, is that a very unrepresentative ultra-right wing has taken over one of our two great political parties, the Republican Party. No more could Rockefeller be a Republican. No more could Nixon be a Republican. No more could Reagan be a Republican. He was pro-choice. Nixon supported, the Republican Party supported the Equal Rights Amendment. It's just gone hugely to the right. And so we wrongly think that the country is divided in two because we have two parties, when actually there are more independents than either Republicans or Democrats. So it's daunting. So I am trying to write a book which is vastly overdue. And I thought at the end, now I would subject you to, for the first time in history, reading some of this book in the hope that it gives you the empowerment as individual citizens and as voters. And these are just my experiences, but symbolically. I went to Missouri to campaign for Harriet Woods because I empathized with the hard time she'd had as a woman journalist, and also because her path into politics was so improbable that no writer could have made it up. When she was a mother of two young children, she had complained about a noisy manhole cover that awakened them every time a car rolled over it. She got nowhere with the city council, so she created a neighborhood petition that closed the street. This success persuaded her to run and win for city council, get appointed to the Highway Commission, and then successfully campaign for the state legislature. I started here because I'm sure there are political candidates, potential candidates and actual candidates right here. she then continued and had a television show and so on, and she found herself running. I don't want to. I'm trying to make it shorter. She ran in a Democratic Party primary because the party wouldn't support her. They thought a woman couldn't win, and they put up a rich guy who'd never been elected to anything, and she beat him 2-1. Okay. Suddenly she was, this is to make you run, okay. Suddenly she was the 1982 Democratic candidate against Republican incumbent Senator John Danforth, the former Attorney General of Missouri, an ordained priest as well as a lawyer, and the grandson of the founder of Ralston Purina. It's like running against the whole patriarchy, you know? Not only did he combine all these forces, but she happened to be the only female Democratic Senate candidate in the entire nation. All that happened, she came, needless to say, all the newly activated feminist electoral groups worked their hearts out, as did her statewide network of dedicated volunteers. And though Missouri, the home of Phyllis Schlafly, was regarded as an anti-choice state, Woods refused to budge on her support for reproductive freedom, and even so, she ran ahead, including in the conservative rural area known as Little Dixie. Then in the last week, she ran out of money for television ads to answer the charges against her, and so she came within less than a heartbreaking 1% of beating Danforth. All that obviously was nearly 2 decades ago, but the effect has continued for decades to come, and you and I in this room tonight are still living with it. First, Wood's narrow loss inspired the creation of Emily's List, something a lot of you know, an acronym for Early Money is Like Yeast, a political action committee devoted to supporting pro-choice Democratic women candidates by bundling checks from members nationwide. It was to become the largest political action committee in the nation. Second, Danforth had once hired in his Attorney General's office a young man named Clarence Thomas. He had left his studies as a Catholic priest to go to law school and thus shared Danforth's unusual combination of priesthood and the law. Once in the U.S. Senate, Danforth again sought out this rare black conservative and took him out of his job as a corporate lawyer for Monsanto, made him a legislative aide, and championed his later career every step of the way. Thomas became chair of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, where he dismantled its strategy of bringing class action suits and pursued only individual cases instead. Indeed, he was such a believer in individualism that he cited novelist Ayn, is that the way you say her name? Ayn Rand? Ayn? I've never known. Ayn? Okay. As his major influence, and he even required his staff at the EEOC to watch The Fountainhead. I can't make this stuff up, you know. The 1947 film version of her most famous novel. Then he served 1 year on the D.C. Court of Appeals, acquired even more value as a rare African American who opposed not only affirmative action but other majority positions of the black community and the civil rights movement. Indeed, he publicly condemned his own sister because she needed welfare for herself and her children, having been left behind while her brother received an education and she did not. After the great civil rights champion Thurgood Marshall retired from the Supreme Court, the first President Bush had the perfect cosmetic conservative to nominate, Clarence Thomas. All right, this one episode, right? Now, a different one, but I promise you they'll come together in a minute. At noon, the day after the presidential election of 2000, I just happened to be speaking at Palm Beach County Community College. I, as you can see, love community colleges because it's so much more the real world than most campuses, you know, so that's why I was speaking there. A year before, I'd been asked to talk about the future of equality, but as it turned out, its immediate future would depend on the election results from that very county. It was about to become the epicenter of the most disputed election in U.S. history. If people in the rest of the country were talking about little else but the cliffhanger between Governor George W. Bush of Texas and Vice President Al Gore of Tennessee, you can imagine an auditorium filled with the people on whose votes that result would depend. All any of us knew at the time was that the count was too close to call, so people were telling their own voting experiences without any of the later news coverage to influence them. A young African-American woman rose to say she'd registered by phone, then been challenged at her polling place because Caucasian was, which incidentally is a totally made-up word by just a guy who made up the word Caucasian. It has no meaning whatsoever. Anyway, was printed next to her name. Indeed, she never did get to vote. An older African-American man said he was denied the right to vote because he had a felony conviction, yet in fact he'd never been accused of a crime, much less convicted. Someone shouted out, "Yes, you have. It's called voting while black." Amid the laughter, another man rose to explain that names of those with felonies had been merged with the voter rolls without checking whether more than one person might have the same name. A white man of 40 or so got up to explain that after voting for Gore, he had looked at the new sample ballot on the way out and realized that he'd actually voted for Pat Buchanan, a third-party candidate who was to the right even of Bush, not only anti-gay and anti-abortion, but also anti-immigration, anti-multiculturalism, anti-you name it. This man had asked to have his ballot negated so he could vote again, but was told there was no second chance. This got a shocked silence, then groans and some shouts of, "I did that too." Outrage spread like wildfire. In that room alone, this new ballot had confused a dozen or so people into voting for Buchanan. On top of that, others had not been able to vote at all. A busload of people from a retirement home had been directed to the wrong polling place, or lines were too long for people with young children, or ballot boxes were missing altogether, or computers and phones were too few to check credentials. Governor Jeb Bush had promised to deliver Florida to his brother. Then black voters had registered in unprecedented numbers, but he was delivering the state anyway. Finally, a white man of 30 or so rose to face me. In the name of his military service to his country, he said, and also in the name of his young daughter, who he wanted to grow up in a democracy, will you stay and help us organize a protest tomorrow and the next day and the next, whatever it takes? More silence. I could feel the pull to say yes. But I also thought I would damage the credibility of local voters who were coming forward with their own irrefutable experiences. Their voices were the source of power. I and others would be called outside agitators and confuse the focus, I explained. I promised instead to take the name, address, and polling place of everyone who hadn't been able to vote for their chosen candidate and give them to lawyers for Gore and nonpartisan watchdogs outside the state. I went home, I did as I promised, and in fact the numbers were staggering. Out of 706 people in the auditorium, at least 100 had been either unable to vote for their chosen candidate or to vote at all. If there were this many in one random auditorium, how many in all of Palm Beach County or the state? When Bush's lead was down to 537 votes, fewer than the number of people in that college auditorium, he was declared the winner by Florida's Secretary of State, as you probably remember, who also happened to be the co-chair of his campaign. And then the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that there was no uniform recount standard to meet the Equal Protection Clause, no time to create one, therefore the recount must be stopped. It was a decision that would be compared with Dred Scott, the 19th century Supreme Court ruling that no black person, slave or free, could ever become a citizen of the United States. All right, now here's the empowering part, I hope. For want of a nail, the horseshoe was lost. For want of a horseshoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the war was lost. This parable should be the mantra of everyone who thinks that voting doesn't matter. If Harriet Woods hadn't been narrowly defeated by Danforth, he wouldn't have been a senator. If Danforth hadn't been a senator, he couldn't have taken Clarence Thomas with him to Washington. If Thomas had stayed a lawyer for Monsanto, He wouldn't have been appointed by the first President Bush to the EOC and then to the Supreme Court. If he hadn't had those credentials, he wouldn't have been nominated for the Supreme Court by the same President Bush. If he hadn't been on the Supreme Court, he wouldn't have been the one-vote margin that halted the Florida court-ordered recount and put the second President Bush in the White House. Later, as you know, all the Florida ballots were examined, and the conclusion was that if any standard, by any standard that could have been used, Gore would have won. This adds a lot more to the parable of the nail. Then Bush II couldn't have caused yet another optional war in Iraq, plus the biggest transfer of wealth from public to private hands in the history of this nation, or yet another optional war in Iraq, or high-level disbelief in global warming, or public schools with abstinence-only education enforced by federal funding that helped create the highest unwanted pregnancy rate in the developed world, or an executive order giving billions in tax dollars to faith-based centers of right-wing political power, or the global gag rule that deprived poor countries of U.S. foreign aid if they offered any information about abortion, even with their own funds, or corporate profiteering on privatized wars abroad as well as privatized prisons at home, or a higher percentage of the U.S. population in prison than in any country in the world, and very racially determined, as you know, or corporate CEOs whose salaries rose from 30 times that of the average worker before this period to an average of 1,000 times now, 1,000 times that of the average worker, or an unregulated financial industry that led to a worldwide economic meltdown and an even greater polarization of people and nations into rich and poor, or the turning of terrorism from a cause for global unity into a cause for deeper global division, and so much more. I still dream about that veteran and his daughter. I so wish I had said yes. It isn't that I think I could have made a difference, believer though I am in the power of one nail. I probably would have been too little and too late. Looking back, however, I realized that I'd done things that seemed crucial and worth much at the time, but they had no impact at all. Yet minor things I'd done in the moment, for instance, talking about credit unions and casually and coming back to find that women had formed the biggest one in Texas and so on, had meant that I'd come back years later to find huge differences had been made. The truth is we don't know what we do is important and which is not. Encouraging someone else's action or just listening to someone who never before felt they were worth listening to could be more important than anything I did or said myself or anything you did or said yourself. The art of acting ethically and effectively is acting as if everything we do matters. To put it another way, a sparrow doesn't sing because she or he has a purpose. A sparrow sings because he or she has a song. Thank you.